Thanks, Rich. In accordance with the provisions of Section 10:4-8D of the Open Public Meetings Act, the date, location, and time of the commencement of this meeting is reflected in a meeting notice, a copy of which schedule has been filed with the village manager and the village clerk, the Ridgewood News, and the Record newspapers, and posted on the bulletin board in the entry lobby of the village municipal offices at 131 North Maple Avenue, and on the village website, all in accordance with the provisions of the Open Public Meetings Act.
Okay, please stand for the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, roll call, Michael.
Mayor Knudsen,
Here.
Councilman Voigt,
Here.
Mr. Torrielli, here. Ms. McWilliams,
Here.
Mr. Scheibner,
Here.
Mr. Joel,
Here.
Ms. Patiri, Ms. Bartow,
Here.
Chief Van Gore.
Okay, thanks, Michael. All right, we have a quorum, and this is a special meeting, so we have only one item on the agenda exclusively. It's 257 Ridgewood Avenue, LLC, Block 3703, Lot 4, 6, and 8.01, preliminary and final major site plan. The attorney on this matter is Tom Brunage. And Tom, I guess we've had 3 hearings so far, July 18th, August 15th, and September 19th. And the last time we heard from the architect and the traffic engineer, so you have the floor to proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, on behalf of my client, we thank you for scheduling this special meeting, and we're pleased to be able to be here and present what we hope will be concluding witnesses this evening so we can bring this matter to a conclusion and a vote. Earlier this evening, I delivered to your secretary proof of publication, affidavits, an affidavit of service, as well as proof of publication and proof of mailing, so that the particular provisions of the statute or statutes were addressed and met, so that I would suggest, Mr. Martin, a review of the documentation given to Mr. Caffarelli would show that jurisdiction is established, notice has properly been given.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. So, you're right, Mr. Chairman, in that last meeting we finished hearing from the traffic engineer, Eric Keller. As the board might recall, as we came to the end, well, not quite the end of the evening, but the evening ended with your consultant indicating that he felt it was appropriate that the matter conclude at that point, or the testimony conclude at that point. He had nothing, as I understood it and read the record, to ask of Mr. Keller, but that he was going to communicate with Mr. Keller, with respect to some capacity analyses in the intervening time since the last meeting and tonight. And it's my understanding that that conversation has taken place. Some other questions apparently may have been addressed by Mr. Jarr, but I'll let him speak to it since my witness has nothing further to say, but we're here, he's here, Mr. Keller's here, available to answer questions should they come up.
Okay. I guess, John, did you want to report on that, your meeting?
Certainly, Board. Previously sworn.
Chris.
Previously sworn?
Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
And previously qualified, Mr. Bruno, satisfied with that?
That's correct. Thank you.
Board, for the sake of the record, and to make sure I cover everything, I have a brief report for you. I did indeed meet with Mr. Keller, and we have forged through the traffic matters. My last report was dated September 7th, and I just want to go over the list of things that I've reviewed for this application and what the conclusion of my review is. We were provided reports on January 31st, 2013, a revised report May 27th, 2014, a new report of May 31st, 2016, and another new report of July 9th, 2017. These are the various reports which I've reviewed for the Enclave project, which is before the board currently, in my analysis, and what was contained in those reports are various traffic analysis and parking analysis. At our meeting with Mr. Keller yesterday on the 17th, He also provided me with additional traffic data and some summary reports that I requested in my September 7th memorandum. For the sake of my September memorandum, I'd like to point out to the board that Mr. Keller has satisfied all of the questions and comments which are contained in that memorandum, and we feel that he has now provided all the necessary traffic data and information as needed so that we can properly review this application and render an opinion. As discussed with Mr. Keller, we discussed the fair share traffic evaluation, and we estimated the cost to replace the traffic signal at Franklin and North Maple at somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. The applicant has agreed to stipulate to a contribution to this traffic improvement of $60,000. This equates to approximately 20% contribution. Based on their traffic analysis, their percent traffic impact is less than 20%. Therefore, my report to this board that this is a fair and reasonable arrangement for them to have to mitigate any traffic impacts that are caused by this project. And that is my report.
Okay, did anyone have any questions for John? Jeff, you go ahead.
John, what was the extent of the $250,000, $300,000 upgrade for the light? What was that made up of?
That was an hour and a half of arguing over what the improvement should be. And in my opinion, it needed to be a completely new traffic signal, new handicap ramps, curb ramps, pedestrian push buttons, pedestrian indications, milling and resurfacing of the intersection. And the only thing wasn't included in that was any drainage improvements. I felt that if we had drainage issues there, that probably was reasonable for the town or the county to take some responsibility. So pretty much everything I could imagine goes into that 250 to 300.
Does that include an actuated light? Is that what
Yes, sir.
type of light is?
Video detection cameras and pedestrian actuated talking push buttons.
Okay. So how does that affect the other lights that are along Franklin and the light at East Ridgewood Ave and Maple if they're not actuated? What does that do?
Well, any traffic light which we can improve in Ridgewood will be an improvement for everything. Sadly, I'll be pushing the congestion down to the next light if I fix this one. So, for example, if we fix the light here, most likely the light at Oak is going to experience some additional congestion because we're going to be able to process the traffic more efficiently at this location. So sadly, unless we improve all the lights someday, when we fix one, it's going to push some of the traffic to the next light, causing some additional delay there.
I don't know, I'm confused because it sounds like it's making it better at that intersection, but it's making it worse at all the other intersections. And I don't know how that affects our overall traffic flow downtown. I mean, can you help me with that?
The further we get from the subject intersection that we're improving, obviously the more the traffic will disperse and, go throughout the town to their destinations. So as far as the noticeability of it, the further we get, the less noticeable it will be. But honestly, it's just a common sense approach. If I make Franklin work better and North Maple work better, more traffic is going to get through that intersection and make its way to Oak. We already have problems at Oak. Oak backs up past the Starbucks driveway every morning. And so, if I fix one intersection, realistically, that traffic's going to continue to move down the line.
Thanks.
Okay, Dave?
As a follow-up to that question, why does that not constitute part of their burden when fixing that one intersection just pushes the problem further out?
It's because of the dispersion. By the time we get to Oak, the percentage impact they have on it is not noticeable enough. Right? The further I get from their site, the less their impact is. So we have to focus on where they have the greatest impact to gain the best benefit to the village.
Okay, thank you.
Just as we are working with the county to ensure that all of the lights are appropriately upgraded, we could actually just, I guess, hand it all to the county and their portion would be applied to the total overall cost. That would work then, right? If they did all the kind of engineering work and...
My understanding of the agreement with the developer, you could clarify it, is that they are going to simply hand the village this compensation, and then the village would now have that, and now you use it as yours.
Right. So, okay, fine, then we're good. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. That's definitely to the village's best interest, for it to be ours to give to the county as our contribution.
Right, because then the county will take the whole thing, and then we'll put in our portion, and we'll apply their portion, and then the county hopefully will come to an agreement, and they'll make up, do their share. So we'll all work together. Okay.
Yeah, that would be our hope.
Okay, Francis, any questions?
I don't have any questions, thank you.
Melanie?
You negotiated the 20%? Was that what you, and
I have many reports and lots of traffic data. There was a significant discussion about the percentage as well. I am confident that their percent impact is less than 20%. Therefore, 20%, in my opinion, is a very fair and reasonable assessment.
okay, I respectfully disagree, but I'm not sure there's any more to say about that currently, but.
Well, from a number standpoint, I know what their numbers are, all right? So we can calculate their percent of their traffic that they're putting there based on what's already there. And that's how we can come up with a percent impact. So it's a mathematical thing. It's actually empirical.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Joel?
No questions.
It was 60,000, and I'm sure you tried to obtain more, but under the circumstances, you think that's fair and reasonable?
Absolutely, yes.
All right, thanks. Chris, did you have any questions?
Yes. The county and our engineering division have been discussing improvements on the Maple Avenue corridor. We're looking at a macro approach, looking at coordinating the intersections of Maple and East Ridgewood Avenue with the traffic light at Franklin and Maple. County has provided a sketch of some of their thoughts. We provided a counter sketch with some of our thoughts based on certain traffic movements we see very prevalent in this corridor area. One of the big concerns we have is the right turning bus from East Ridgewood Avenue up going north onto North Maple. That corner is very tight where the Jersey Mike's is. We've had some exchange of emails and ideas, and that's about where it is. The only thing that may affect this application is depending if they have any front yard variances, and if the county would be looking for an additional taking for widening the corridor there. But they haven't gotten back to us yet.
Okay. Okay, Beth, do you have any questions for John?
No, I do not.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Actually, I'd have one, so just to kind of remind me, because we had that road widening easement, that was the staircase, am I recalling this correctly? The staircase was in the road widening easement, and that may have been a problem for the county.
Are you referring to the ADA accessible ramp on East Ridgewood Avenue? That was something that...
On Maple, on the front of the structure, the
architect.
yeah, not on Ridgewood Ave, not on Ridgewood Ave, not the ramp.
No, the front stoop.
Oh, I thought Chris just said Ridgewood Ave, it's Maple. Did you say Ridgewood
Yeah,
Ave?
Maple.
Yeah, the council granted an encroachment agreement for the PNC Bank on East Ridgewood Avenue for that encroachment.
No, when I'm talking about the road widening easement on Maple.
Mm-hmm. There are some things that may be a little bit in the way. Again, that's to be determined in how the design process goes forward. Working with the county, it's not exactly a rapid process. Usually you send them an email and a few months later you get a response.
Okay.
Could I ask Chris a question? Is that possible?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, good. Chris, your report on August 14, 2017, the preliminary review of submitted materials, you mentioned about traffic. You said Franklin Ave and North Maple Ave are Bergen County roads, and as such, the county may want the road widening easement as part of their approval process?
Yes, this application also has to get county planning board approval.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure where they are in that process and whether the county planning board has given them approval yet. They'll have to get it nonetheless. If there's any significant changes to their proposal due to complying with the county requirements, they may have to come back to this board.
So,
I think Mr. Brunich may have a bit more up-to-date comment on that.
yeah, so, does that affect the estimate of $250,000 to $300,000 if we have to widen that whole area?
It can considerably.
So, John, how do you feel about that? The fact that we may have to widen that whole intersection, I mean, it sounds like it's going to be a lot more money.
If there's widening required by, first of all, I don't know if the county's gonna do that. We have the one corner would, I think, be very difficult to widen because it's not under their control. But if the county planning board, desires that, I don't know if there's room to widen out there though. Does it make sense to make that wider? I mean, it's already a 3-lane approach on the Franklin side.
Well, Chris, you had mentioned before, I think that Brecorama, that you wanted to kind of cut off some of that and widen it at that area to make it more manageable. Was that your thought?
That was one of the areas we looked at. I know the county would like to take the bend out of the road a little bit. Basically, it's like if you're going southbound on Maple as you approach Franklin, looking towards Ridgewood, you'll see that there's a bit of a bend in the road. They're looking at kind of cutting that bend back, make like a tangent cut there. How that'll fit within the existing easements that have already been granted from past applications, and what the design will be remains to be seen. And also, as I said, what the county planning board may require.
So, is that like an eminent domain kind of thing we have to do if we need to widen that?
There may be an eminent domain issue. The goal would be to design something within the existing right-of-way as best as possible to avoid that very action.
This all seems like much more of a problem than initially suggested. I don't know. That's kind of the way I'm feeling right now.
I don't think
whole
so,
area.
because the county has come back to us. I believe you were with us when we met with the county engineering staff. I think the drawing that they sent to us for our look at was a result of that meeting, and yours and the village manager's request for the county assistance and county involvement in improving our intersections. So they are getting back. I feel they're being responsive to the village's requests. It's going to be a design process with both parties, village and county, and also obviously the applicant for improving that corridor.
So what happens if it costs more than the $300,000? I mean, who eats that?
Well, right now, if the direction the county is going is they would take over the operation and the ownership of the traffic lights. Currently, the village owns the traffic light at East Ridgewood Avenue and Maple, and at Maple and Franklin. We operate, we maintain, change the bulbs and so forth. With a new upgraded light funded by the county, they would have that right and also that obligation to maintain the light.
So they would pay for it, is that what you're saying?
I believe they would pay for it. Would they pay for it 100% or in full? That's not yet been determined.
Okay.
That's certainly the hope that we would have on the village's behalf.
What could make it fairly simple is that I could discuss any approval process with Mr. Brunich, and if there is a recommendation by the board's traffic consultant in accordance with any approval and is agreed upon by the applicant, if there's any change to that and there's the nexus of off-track improvement that is related to the application built into the resolution, they would agree to up any additional amount that's related to that. For example, if Chris, and I believe you're accurate, the county is responsible for economic costs of this new intersection, fine. But if it's visited upon the village, then that nexus would be a percentage tied to the applicant, and I find that to be a reasonable request in a resolution, so I'm sure they would agree.
I think that's a very good approach. I think the contribution amount that John had negotiated with them and the manner that it would be basically set aside in escrow by the village for signalized intersection improvements would also work very well with any partnership the village has with the county.
Mr. Brunage, has the applicant or any of its professionals been in touch with the county on this?
At this point, no.
Okay. I guess you're waiting for the result of this, and then you'll make
Yeah, we'll
application.
move forward and, accordingly. And Mr. Martin is referring to basic theory, which I think we both know. We're happy to discuss it. Please don't take my standing here and willingness to discuss it as an agreement to do anything other than to abide by really what the case law says. I call it a Dunkin' Donuts situation. I think it's the relevant case. And so I don't think it's appropriate or necessary that we get into the weeds or the legalities of such an exaction. But nonetheless, we'll see what the end result of the exercise with the county is. I mean, there's no question it's a reality. It's going to have to be addressed.
Okay. All right. All right. I guess does the public have any questions for John Jar at all? Okay. We'll move on. You can present your next witness.
Thank you. The notice that was provided for tonight's meeting incorporated the application filed by 257 and particularly by Mike Dipple on behalf of 257 for a major soil movement permit. And so because there are some elements to that information which touch on planning, we are suggesting that Dipple go forward with presenting to the board the major soil movement documents and plan, discuss it, answer whatever questions you may have, and then move right along and bring up John Szabo, who will bring us through the reasons as to why we believe the applicant has met the burden of proof to get the variance and waiver relief that is requested, including any of the planning aspects that might relate to the major soil movement permit.
Okay, sure. All right, proceed.
And I see Mr. Dipple is setting up, but you remain sworn and qualified. Thank you.
We do need to mark these new exhibits, Mr. Martin. I believe that we are at AR 13. What do you have those exhibits?
Mike, could you maybe move your display a little bit? You're interfering with the camera.
Yeah, my last exhibit is AR 12.
So the next, yeah, but there's two sheets, Mike?
Two sheets, yes.
Yeah, so the first sheet would be AR 13. Just mark it if you would, and then we'll get the reference to it into the record in a second. And the second would be AR 14. Mr. Dipple, you have marked two sheets. Would you, for the purposes of the record, describe, please, the sheets that you've marked and explain what they are?
Sure. The first sheet, SM01, is ground floor soil movement calculation, and it depicts the site, and it has some calculations which I'll describe later. And the second sheet is SM02, which is first floor soil movement calculation, and it depicts the upper floor, which coincides with Franklin Avenue, so it's set up the same way as my site plan is set up, ground floor being accessible to North Maple and first floor being accessible to Franklin Avenue. Okay? So essentially what we did is we created a grid pattern because of the irregularity of the site and the changes in the slope and the fact that there are buildings on the site. And this is what we typically do when we have kind of an odd shaped property or undulating property is we set up a grid and we just calculate the change in grade at each corner. We average the four corners, and we multiply it by the area, and it just gives us the volume of the soil that's going to be moved within that little grid. So if you were to look at that, you would see these little numbers, and then down here is a spreadsheet that calculates exactly, in the same fashion, exactly what the soil cut and soil fill would be. So in summary, on the first floor, we have a cut of 3,938 cubic yards, and that results from the ground level parking, the ground floor parking level that I've discussed, where the grade naturally rises in the back. So when we bring a relatively level parking garage in, we do remove that wedge of soil starting at North Maple and continuing back where we have the wall that supports the ground level garage.
Let me interrupt you for a second, just so the record is clear. You're referring now to the exhibit that you've already marked as AR-13.
This is AR-13.
Right, and AR-13 describes, generally speaking, the site of the proposed project. Is that so?
That's correct.
And that site information is consistent with the survey and the site plan prepared by your office. I wouldn't say the survey was prepared by your office, but the survey utilized by your office and the site plan prepared by your office, which is you've previously testified to and which is in marked for identification and been the subject of the discussion prior to this evening's meeting.
That's correct.
Right. So, and what you have done now is explain how, as an engineer, you've gone about calculating the volume of material to be moved and placed consistent with what?
Consistent with the proposed construction. Okay. Right. So in this case, as I described, it's really on the ground floor, it's completely an excavation. We have a cut column here, and then we would normally have a fill column, which we often do in green, and that would show cut and fill, and then they would total up, but because this entire floor is an excavation, we only have cut, and our total cut is 3,938 cubic yards, which by itself qualifies for a major soil movement permit application, and that's why that was filed. I'm going to flip over to the second page, AR-14, Exhibit AR-14. And now we show some change in grade along the proposed parking lot, which is accessible from Franklin Avenue. And we do the same methodology for that small rectangular area where we set up a grid, we check the four corners, we multiply it by the area, and we have our calculations show a total cut of only 178 cubic yards, and we do have a slight fill of 1/10 of a cubic yard just because some of the grade changes slightly to make it to the new structure. So as a result, adding them together, we get 178 cubic yards. So when we combine the ground floor, and the first floor, we have a total soil movement, which appears in our application, of 4,116 cubic yards, in which we've paid a fee of $1,179.
Now, you just made reference to the application filed by your office on behalf of 257, and that was delivered to Mr. Rutenheiser, as the village engineer.
Yes.
Reviewed with him, and I believe it's fair to say that you've met with the village engineer and gone over your calculations.
I have discussed it briefly with him at the end of last week.
Yeah. Any questions, issues, or comments from the village engineer with respect to the consistency of the application with the ordinance and the conclusion that you reached?
I believe that I described to Mr. Ruthhauser where, how the cut, how the cut, we resulted in such a cut, and I believe I can say that he concurred with that. And I present these plans and present them here to the board.
I have no further questions of the witness on the issue of the soil movement.
Jeff, do you have any questions?
No.
Dave?
Yep.
Susan? Francis?
No, I don't have any questions.
Melanie?
No.
Joel? Okay, I don't have any. Or Chris, do you have any questions?
No, the testimony was consistent with the meeting that we had. Project unfortunately needs a major soil permit due to its size and scope, so we have a process for that.
Okay, and then I guess you monitor the removal, and they have certain regulations that they have to follow and everything.
Yeah, there'll be a comprehensive resolution for the governing body to approve. There'll be involvement with our police department. We'll need to know what the trucking routes are, where they're going, if they're going through a school zone. For example, if they're going to go down East Ridgewood Avenue towards Route 17, we're going to ask that they not truck during the prime inflow and outflow from the high school, and so forth. Usually, the traffic bureau and the police department is very good on that. We're always on top of it.
And there'll be provisions that there's not dirt on the roads and things like that, too?
Yes, because any contractor that leaves mud on the road inevitably will end up in municipal court.
Okay, all right.
It's usual stipulations, I'm sure Mr. Brunage would agree with that.
Sorry, I think I heard my name mentioned.
In terms of the soil movement process with the truck routes, coordinating with the police and things like that, and responsible for cleanup and things, that's usually in the resolution.
Absolutely, and certainly we understand what the ordinance says, and I believe the action of the board is actually to send this application to the village council.
Okay. Beth, do you have any questions?
No, I don't.
Okay. John, do you have any questions? It's not really of a traffic nature, but okay.
I just have a quick question. How many truckloads is that?
Basically, you're only going to have an approximation because soil...
Yeah, approximate. I wouldn't hold you to it.
And also
exact.
depends if you're using like a 15-yard tandem or if you start running triaxles with 18 or 20 yards.
Just to average, how many? Say that again.
How many yards did you say, Mr. DePaul?
4,000 roughly.
Little less, yeah. So like 350, would it be?
Let's use 18. 222, 230 truckloads. Export. But you also have to consider it's not going to be all at once. It might be 3, 4, 5 trucks a day.
Hang on, I didn't hear you, Chris, sorry.
It's not all at once. It might be 3 or 4 trucks a day, 5 trucks a day, because it is a tight site, so they're not going to be able to do a mass excavation all at once. Mr. Dipple can correct me if I misjudge that.
I concur with his numbers, and it does go relatively quickly. It does seem like a lot of trucks, but it does go relatively quick, and the impact, it's a big number, but the impact is not as it seems. The trucks, recirculate. And I agree that we haven't planned exactly how the construction goes, but we will be demolishing a building, and we could be working in that area, and then, putting up the wall that surrounds the parking deck, and then moving some soil, and so it may be spread out a little bit, but it's not as big a number as it kind of seems. It's not, in relative construction terms, it's a relatively small number.
Okay.
Okay, does anyone from the public have any questions? All right, seeing there none?
Thanks, Mr. Dipple. Our final witness called John Zabo. Pull a chair up.
Mr. Zabo, how are you? Raise your right hand. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
And just for the record, your name and your business address.
Sure. My name is John, middle initial P, Sabo, S-Z-A-B-O, Jr. I'm senior associate with Burgess Associates. Our business office is at 25 Westwood Avenue, Westwood, New Jersey.
And you're a professional planner licensed in the state of New Jersey?
I'm a licensed professional planner in the state of New Jersey. I've been a practicing planner for over 30 years. I'm also a certified planner and member of the American Institute of Certified Planners, which is an umbrella organization of the APA that's nationally recognized as a planning credential. I've testified before numerous boards throughout the state of New Jersey. My primary practice has always been mostly in municipal planning. In fact, I've appeared before this board as well as the Ridgewood Board of Adjustment.
And so qualified tonight as a professional planner. Thank you.
That's right.
So we so move him and ask you to accept him as such. So, Mr. Zabo, having qualified as an expert, you were engaged by 257 Ridgewood Ave LLC to do a review of the proposed project consistent with the site plans and other documents that have been filed as part of this application. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you've viewed it from the point of view of the planning issues that the application seeks, or presents, I should say. So tell us, if you would, your understanding of what the project is, and then let's take the board through the project and from your unique perspective and perch, if you will, from the planning perspective.
Okay. Over the course of 4 hearings, the board has heard a lot of the how this development will proceed, from the engineer in terms of how the site is going to be laid out, from the architect as to how the building is going to be designed, both interiorly and exteriorly. You've heard from the traffic engineer as to how traffic impacts were analyzed and are handled in parking as well. I'm going to talk more about the why. Why this fits into the community, how and why it's a good project in terms of planning and your zoning ordinances, and most particularly with respect to your master plan. By doing so, I think I'm going to really focus on the planning end of it and not get into repetitive testimony that you've heard before. I appreciate and recognize that this is a special meeting, so I'll proceed and focus mostly on the planning aspects of this application and not get into a lot of the engineering details and the architectural details that have been previously testified to, other than as it supports my testimony as the applicant's planner. But it is important, although the board is well acquainted with the subject property, I think for purposes of the record, we want to be on the same page and identify the property that we are discussing. The property address is 253-257 East Ridgewood Avenue. It is identified as block 3703, lots 4, 6, 8.01 by tax assessment records. And it's going to be relevant to my testimony later on, but it is a irregularly shaped parcel with 3 street frontages, 114 feet of frontage on East Ridgewood Avenue, which runs east-west, 351 feet of frontage on North Maple Avenue, which runs north-south, and 50 feet of frontage on Franklin Avenue, which runs east-west. The site occupies an area of 1.37 acres, and we all know it as the former C.O. Fons department store, which is now basically a mixed commercial use project. In terms of its location and adjoining land uses, the site is located within basically the edge of the village's central business district, which is characterized by commercial uses. There are some multifamily uses in the area, in fact, one directly across the street on Franklin Avenue from the subject property. The applicant proposes to renovate the former Seal Funds building and demolish a portion of the building as well to redevelop it as a mixed-use commercial residential site. It will have ancillary parking both below and integrated into the building, and it will also include 39 market rate rental units along with 8 affordable housing rental units as well, which will consist of 15 bedrooms. And that was testified to by Mr. Thomas Taranto, who's president of the Bergen County United Way, as to the type of units. These are going to be special needs units, one that will also qualify as affordable housing units under your COA requirements, which is important because that is a very particular requirement of the BR3 zone in which this property is located. So as I said, the property is located in the B3R zone. Now, the zone was created in direct response to a very specific master plan amendment that was adopted by the Planning Board on June 2nd of 2015, which really sought to permit the type of mixed-use development that the applicant is proposing within certain very specific properties and areas close by and within the central business district. So it permits a variety of mixed uses as well as for residential development to occur above storefronts. There is a requirement in this particular case with the B3R zone because of the density of the proposed project that 13% of the affordable units that are being set aside as part of this project will be in fact dedicated for very low income households. That was testified to by Mr. Taranto, and clearly this will be a compliant project with respect to that requirement. Now, I think from the perspective of the zone, B3R zoning, that it's an obvious observation that the proposal is in substantial compliance with the zone requirements. The only variance with respect to bulk, setback, area, and all of that is required is really a building height variance to permit a building height of 54.92 feet, where 50 feet is the maximum height. Now, we're going to treat this as a C, or bulk height variance, as opposed to a D6 variance because it's beneath the 10-foot and 10% criteria that would trigger a use variance. So it's within a site plan C variance context that I will be talking to later on. Other than that, the project is in substantial compliance, but it does require some relief, and they're enumerated in your planner's report, and I'll repeat it for the record so that we'll know what I need to address for this board in terms of the variances. In terms of parking, it has been called out that there are 141 parking spaces required and 131 parking spaces provided, so that there is a parking variance that may be triggered by this application. But as I will discuss later on, the ordinance does permit a shared parking arrangement that was testified to by the applicant's traffic engineer, which can satisfy the parking demand that's been presented to the village board on behalf of this project. A variance is required from 190-118-4F12B2 to permit front yard parking on Franklin Avenue. A variance is required from section 190-118-4F12B3 to permit which requires a 5-foot parking setback from side and rear lot lines. The parking setbacks that are proposed are 2.14 feet from lot 15 and 3.16 feet from lot 5. Variance is required from section 190-118-4F10D, which requires screening of parking beneath buildings by structural elements. There is visibility of the parking structure from Franklin Avenue and Ridgewood Avenue, and certain aspects of that remain unscreened. There is a variance that is required under section 190-124F2B, which is a setback for retaining walls with fence. The requirement is that the setback equal the height of the retaining wall, which is 8.5 feet. 1.14 feet is proposed. And finally, a variance is required from section 190-124F2, which limits the retaining wall height to 6 feet, and 8.5 feet is proposed. There are also some design exceptions that are required as a result of the development. Section 190-84 references street trees where 10 trees are required There are 8 trees that are existing, 2 are to be removed, therefore 4 are required as identified by your planner. In terms of the depth of the parking spaces under section 190, parking without the 2-foot overhang is required to be 20 feet. The applicant is proposing 18. And then section 190-80 requires curbing, and there's curbing missing in some limited locations within the parking area.
John, let me interrupt you for a second. Clearly, your knowledge of the site, your knowledge of the material is apparent from your ability to move as quickly, but as completely as you needed to in describing the relief that the applicant is seeking. Clearly, we're looking for some C variances, and we're looking for some waivers. Talk to the board, if you will, based on your experience, your knowledge, your education, on just what the variances are all about, and what the standard of proof is, and just what you believe, if you can so testify, what the applicant has shown by way of the testimony that's been elicited so far.
What I'm going to get into are the planning aspects of why the relief is required and the basis upon which I believe the board can grant the relief. And it boils down to the statutory criteria, and it's been outlined by your planner, and I'm just going to kind of summarize it. There are 2 basic criteria upon which a board can grant relief under the C variance. There's what you've probably heard many times over, the C1 variance criteria, which is really where the strict application of a regulation would result in a peculiar and exceptional practical difficulty, an exceptional and undue hardship due to some aspect of the property that creates a hardship because of exceptional narrowness, shallowness, shape of a parcel, because of extreme or exceptional topographic conditions or physical features that could prevent an applicant from complying, or by some reason of extraordinary exceptional situation uniquely affecting a specific piece of property, or the structures that are lawfully on that parcel that could create a hardship. That would be your C1 or hardship. But there's also the C2 criteria, and the C2 was introduced by the state legislature with the intent of kind of liberalizing the variance application process, and it's commonly referred to as the flexible C, because it's not tied to hardship or to some physical feature of the property, but rather that the benefit of granting a variance outweighs any substantial detriment that might ensue as a result of that. And the way you go about addressing that is you have to show that by granting the variance, that the purposes of the municipal land use law are advanced by the deviation, that the grant, and then you know that somehow that benefit outweighs any detriment, and that benefit accrues to the community as a whole. It cannot be specific to a particular property owner, but has to be to the benefit of the community. And that's an important aspect of the C2. And the way I like to characterize the C2 is that where there is a better planning alternative to the strict application of a zone requirement, that generally common sense plays and would encourage a board to grant relief where it makes sense. I mean, that's really the benefit of the C2. I believe that in terms of this application, that the variances that I cited can be granted both under the C1 and C2 criteria. And it is possible to have both criteria in play when you address variances, because they are both, in this case, very relevant to the board's consideration.
John, now you've basically laid out, again, very clearly and rather succinctly the standards that the board has to take into account to grant the relief that we seek, both the variance relief and the waiver relief. Familiar as you are with the project and with the site, with the project, with the filings, et cetera, can you tell the board what you believe the basis for the relief is with respect to the granting of the variances applied for?
Certainly. In terms of the C1 physical hardships, I said earlier I described the property as irregularly shaped. The property has narrow frontage along Franklin Avenue, East Ridgewood Avenue, and it widens towards the middle and along its frontage on Maple, and it's got this very strange oblong shape. So we're dealing with an irregularly shaped parcel, And despite the fact that it has this strange configuration, or not conventional configuration, the development is able to comply with almost all of the requirements of the village zoning code, except for what I would consider very, very minor de minimis type of relief that is required by this application. The majority of the requirements of the village are being satisfied by this development. I know over the course of the numerous hearings that have been held, and as a result of the dialogue that has occurred between the board's professionals, and the applicant's professionals, there have been iterations to address many of the concerns that have been expressed. And that's a very positive development as this moves forward. And so right now what we're dealing with is the leftover of what really can't be dealt with in terms of the physical constraints that the applicant is facing in developing the property. So in terms of the way the site is configured, it does constrain the applicant's ability to configure the parking to, for example, avoid parking within the front yard on Franklin, and to comply with parking setback requirements from lot 15 and 5, and to comply with the retaining wall setback because of the narrowness of the lot. When you start to try to force compliance with those particular sections of the code, you can't develop the property in a way that would implement the purposes of the zoning ordinance and the master plan as it's been defined for this area and for this zone. So I think that creates a physical hardship for the applicant with respect to those variances. Now, the property has frontages on 3 roadways, which creates another extraordinary problem. I don't know in my experience where I've ever had a property. Anytime I've had a property with multiple frontages, it always presents an issue with front yard setback, parking, and everything else, because now you're dealing with a very unusual situation, certainly with respect to this property and the area. So the fact that it has 3 frontages creates a hardship on the applicant in terms of the relief it is required for the Franklin Avenue parking. The priority here is to try to comply with the RSIS requirements, to provide the parking that's required under the village code. And so the ability to move and shift the parking away from Franklin Avenue just isn't there because of the configuration of the parcel, and there isn't enough room, is really what it amounts to. Now, you heard the applicant's engineer describe the topography of the site, and just most recently, within 10 minutes, he described the kind of filling and actually the cutting that has to occur as a result of the existing slopes that are there on the property. It's going to require grading. And it's because of these grade differences that exist on the property that it creates the issue with the height of the building, the retaining wall height, because when you take the strict application of the ordinance and how you measure height, the differences in elevation between this property, adjoining properties, and the way the ordinance requires you to measure height creates a situation where we do in fact exceed the 50-foot maximum height to the height that's being proposed at 54 feet. So again, it's a function of the topography of the site and what the applicant has to deal with. Remember, the applicant here is dealing with redeveloping an existing site. So we're dealing with conditions that are less than perfect and working within the constraints of the property, and really resolving as many difficulties with the issues that presents the applicant, and with respect to complying with the code, that for the most part the applicant's able to comply. But in the case of the topography, there's not much we can do, and we all understand and recognize the way the property is laid out. So again, that creates a physical hardship. So, as I had said, those are the physical aspects of the parcel, but I also believe that there are C2 arguments that can be presented to the board for consideration. And in summary, some of those are that the proposed development is permitted in the zone. Clearly, this is something that the zoning ordinance is seeking to promote as in terms of use. The development itself is in substantial compliance with the village zoning ordinance, but most importantly, the project implements the recommendations of the village's most recent master plan documents. And that, I think, is a very important aspect of this application, and really is very much informed by the master plan documents that have been adopted by the village. Specifically, the 2006 reexamination, most importantly, the 2015 master plan land use amendment, and the 2016 master plan reexam. Now, I'm not going to go into chapter and verse on all these documents. I'm just going to summarize how they're relevant to the proceedings that are here tonight. The 2006 Master Plan re-exam acknowledged that there was a need to diversify the housing stock of the borough, of the village, that there was a need to introduce some different types of housing because that the village was primarily a single-family community. Then in 2015, there was a very specific master plan land use amendment that was adopted by the board back on June 2nd, 2015, that recommended the creation of the Affordable Housing 2 zone, the B3R zone, the CR zone, and the C zone districts. And what's interesting about the document, when you read it, is that it actually incorporates references to certain purposes of the municipal land use law, and then infuses that into the framework of the document in terms of its own objectives. And I found that very intriguing. And so, for example, on page 1 of the document, there's a general objective that reflects the municipal land use law. One of the objectives is to promote the establishment of population densities and concentrations that will contribute to the well-being of persons, neighborhoods, communities, and regions. That's corresponding to purpose number 2E of the land use law. And the objective that ties into that in the amendment of the master plan was that the proposed zone districts can contribute to the well-being of persons in the community by meeting the housing needs of various households. So there's a direct correlation between the purposes of the act and the objective that's contained in the master plan document. And there are numerous examples of that throughout the document. It recognized the synergy between residential development and the promotion of mass transit and economic development, and it tied that into purpose 2G, which is of the land use law, which states that to provide sufficient space in appropriate locations for a variety of residential commercial uses. And again, the objective of the plan tying to that municipal land use law purpose was that the proposed zone districts, of which the BR3 was created, will promote space in appropriate locations for both commercial and residential uses. Another objective or purpose of the land use law that was tied into this document is 2H, which talks about to encourage location and design of transportation routes. And again, the plan went on to talk about the virtues of these properties being designated for development as mixed-use centers near the Ridgewood train station and various mass transit facilities like bus stops and routes. So again, there's a direct connection between the purposes of the land use law and the objectives of the 2015 master plan document. So then there's the 2016 reexamination report, and at that point, the village was already considering the amendments to the village zoning ordinance to implement the 2015 land use amendment, and it was encouraging that the village do so. Again, for the purpose of furthering mixed-use development, transit-friendly development, and to spur a diversity in housing and to also spur economic activity. So by implementing the village master plan, the purposes of the municipal land use law, I think, are also being advanced. And because this project is in substantial compliance with the zoning ordinance and is effectuating the purposes of the master plan documents I've described, I think that you're advancing the intent and purposes of the municipal land use law and therefore can be recognized as a C2 benefit to the public. Now, there are two other, I think, purposes of the land use law that I think are advanced by this project. Purpose 2C, which talks about providing adequate light, air, and open space. I think because this property is being developed appropriately in conformance with your setback requirements and all your coverage requirements, that we're in compliance with your zoning, that we are in fact satisfying and advancing that purpose. And I think also importantly, we're advancing purpose 2I, which is to promote a desirable visual environment through creative design techniques and good civic design and arrangements. I think that there's been tremendous testimony, exhibits presented to the board that shows how the architecture of this development fits within the character of your downtown, how it will enhance the downtown, and how sensitive it is to design criteria that is embodied in your own ordinances. And that was testified to extensively by the applicant's architect. And I agree. I think it's a very attractive development and one that will fit in very well with the community. So Again, and then finally, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this will provide 8 units of special needs housing that will be affordable to very low-income families and households. And that's an important aspect of the development, because first of all, that is one of the purposes that is driving the BR3 zone. I mean, you cannot, according to the ordinance and according to the BR3, you cannot approve a project without some affordable housing component, which this has. This will provide in excess of 13% of very low affordable housing, which will benefit the village in terms of its compliance with its affordable housing obligations under the Mount Laurel Doctrine. And so that is a very, I think, important consideration in the furtherance of the purposes of the land use law, but also the furtherances of your own master planning documents and obligations under the affordable housing laws. Now, no variance can be granted without demonstrating that the relief can be granted without substantial detriment to the public good, to your zone plan, and to your zoning ordinance. And by zone plan, generally, what they're referring to is your master plan. And I think that the negative criteria is satisfied. I think the proposed development is in substantial compliance with the zoning ordinance and with and implements the village's master plan documents, which I think is a very important aspect of the application. I think that the variances that have been requested are fairly de minimis in the context of the overall development and how it's compliant with most of your requirements. I think that the architect has done an admirable job of demonstrating through testimony and exhibits that the building is designed to fit into the character of the surrounding area and is architecturally attractive. There was an exhibit that was testified to and presented to the board that the building fits within the heights of other buildings in the area. It is not going to be overwhelming. In fact, it's not even going to be the tallest building in the area. There are others that are taller. And that analysis was presented to the board in terms of an exhibit and testified to by the applicant's architect. The retaining walls that are referenced in the document as needing variances, really they're required to facilitate the development of the project in conformance with the use provisions of the BR3 zone. The project cannot proceed with the walls where they are. Because of the narrowness of the site, we can't really move the walls, and really it has no impact on adjoining properties. They face mostly the existing paved areas of the municipal parking lot. There's really no change in the property's relationship to the adjoining lots in terms of pavement, facing pavement. That's with regard to the setbacks of the parking areas. Again, I think due to the grade and circulation access requirements, we cannot completely screen the structural parking, but it's really for a portion of the parking areas. It's not the entire section, so you'll get a glimpse of it, but it's not overwhelming to the site because you have the building that kind of encapsulates the parking in the area, and I think that does so to the extent that it can. And everything that could be done to screen or address that issue has been done, and what's remaining is really vestiges of the site and the way it's laid out and the way the project is required to proceed. There's no substantial traffic impact, as been testified to by the traffic engineer, and parking requirements are really, in my opinion, satisfied through the shared parking arrangement, and which is a factor that is permitted in the board's consideration in determining whether there's adequate parking. It's been testified to by the applicant's traffic engineer, and based upon his analysis, using a comparison of the before and after analysis of shared parking arrangements, that at no time under the proposed development is there a shared parking arrangement where there is a shortage of parking, that there's adequate parking being addressed on the site at all times as opposed to now. And let's talk about the change in parking from what exists today and what will be under the proposed development. Right now, you have a shortage of almost 60% in terms of the parking that is required under the current ordinance. Right now, you're required 181 spaces and only 76 are provided. Now, under the proposed development, 141 spaces are required and 131 spaces are provided. Because the development changes the mix of uses on the property in conformance with the BR3 zone requirements, you're actually reducing demand but also increasing supply as a result of the development, so that there's only a 7% shortfall in the technical application of the 141 spaces that have been deemed technically required as calculated by code. But again, I bring the board back to the fact that Shared parking arrangements are permitted. That analysis was done, and there's more than adequate parking to support this project without any negative impact on the surrounding area. I would also note that there's train service, bus service, adequate facilities within the area, as well as municipal parking facilities that are available to address customers who want to visit the site for the first floor commercial uses, and it will function just fine. The final aspect of the application that I was asked to address was the soil movement permit. Section 24611 requires a finding by the planning board after public hearing with notice that the issuance of the permit will comply with the purposes of the chapter and can be granted without impairment to the intent and purposes of the zone plan and master plan of the village. As testified to by the applicant's engineer and can be affirmed by the village engineer, there is no way that the site can be developed in accordance with your zoning as desired by the master plan without soil movement. The grades, the topography exists. In order to get this development built, it will require movement of soil. That's been testified to. I think that it is consistent with the requirements of the BR3 zoning. I don't think it presents a detriment, and I think it would be promoting the purposes of the master plan as it's been adopted by the village. So I think that the permit can receive a favorable recommendation with the appropriate conditions that normally accompany such recommendations and are usually imposed by councils in such situations like bonding, truck traffic routing, and et cetera, that the applicant, of course, would agree to in consultation with the village engineer.
John, I just in reviewing my notes and as we have discussed from time to time in preparation for your appearance here this evening, would you refresh my recollection, and perhaps I was not really fully attentive to what you were saying, with respect to the design standards and the waivers that we're requesting. I think the architect has fairly well testified as to the standards that he utilized, but with respect to the 4 waivers that are part of the application, do you have anything that you'd like to offer to the board?
Well, with respect to the street trees, the village planner, consulting planner, offered alternatives to mitigate that situation, and the applicant has amended the plans to address the concerns that were expressed with regard to 19084 street trees. I think that's reflected in the latest revised plans. Lighting details were testified to by the applicant's engineer. We, of course, will comply with the lighting requirements of the village, and that's standard language. In terms of the depth of the parking space, while we do not have or provide a 2-foot overhang, which requires a 20-foot aisle depth for a parking stall, an 18-foot stall is consistent with RSIS standards, which is usually a 9 by 18 stall configuration, and it will operate just fine in this situation. And in terms of the missing curbing in some locations, that was testified to by the applicant's engineer, and that's really a function of allowing for circulation within the parking garage where it can get a little tight. And so we want to be able to move vehicles and not have obstructions to cars that really don't serve any real purpose within the interior parking lot.
Clearly, parking and shared parking is an issue, and the applicant's position obviously is the parking situation is markedly and positively improved by the parking proposed from the project.
Substantially improved.
Yeah, I would agree. But that said, the ordinance is rather specific with respect to parking, and the parking analysis here is based upon the fact that some portion of the existing Seal Funds building is being converted from office into special needs residential. Is that so?
Yes, that's correct.
And how does that tie into the ordinance and the parking requirement, and therefore compliance with the ordinance?
Well, it was testified to by Mr. Toronto that for the 8 special needs units, they would only need 2 parking spaces, because as special needs households, they receive certain services, maybe some aid, visitation, but they don't necessarily require vehicles because they have access to the mass transit facilities that are connected to the downtown of Ridgewood. So that reduces the parking demand. And then, of course, we're using the RSIS standards for parking as determined by bedroom count. And again, I testified earlier, because the land use combination is changing here, parking demand is changing to the positive with respect to parking demand.
I'd like you to address specifically, however, the concern, I guess, I shouldn't say concern, but the issue at least identified by Mrs. McManus with respect to the affordability controls. And the issue in the ordinance, I shouldn't say issue, but the requirement in the ordinance that we present to the board some proofs that we're prepared to show that the affordable housing credits that will be generated will in fact be...
I thought you were talking about the parking demand. The applicant has an affirmative obligation to address the affordable housing requirements of the BR3 zone. And that will be accomplished through the dedication of 8 apartments, 15 bedrooms to special needs housing. That will be done. Now, what will happen is that that's been testified to. We are in compliance with that requirement. That'll be embodied in any resolution that this board will adopt in granting any approval if it was so inclined to this project. It will carry over into the affordable housing plan eventually that will be prepared on behalf of the village. And so it will become then restricted in compliance with COA requirements so that it can be counted as towards your obligation, and so that you could receive credit for it as well. And so it'll have to be compliant with COA regulations, and that'll be embodied within the agreements pursuant to the resolution of approval and any documents ensuing from that as a result of the village's affordable housing plan.
Thank you. I have nothing further to ask Mr. Szabo at this time, and I'd welcome questions from the board to him.
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome.
Okay, Jeff, do you have any questions?
You referred to Elizabeth McManus's report, August 11th, is that correct? And that there were 62 spaces required and there's only 53 available. So there's a shortage, I guess, of 9 for the non-residential uses. And then you went down to say on the shared parking side, the shared parking ordinance, it says, shared parking is permitted provided the practical number of parking spaces needed is based on various factors, including but not limited to the nature of the non-residential uses. So I guess my question is, are there non-residential uses that would actually exacerbate this and make it worse? And, I think we talked about this before. If a restaurant went in there or a real estate agent went in there, I mean, you could increase the number of spaces needed significantly based on just the demand that those particular types of uses would require. So does that necessarily mean that we have to preclude those types of uses? Because it would seem to me to make the situation worse. So should that be a stipulation if we're going to allow them to build this, that they can't have those kind of uses in there because it would just make everything worse?
And Elizabeth McManus, you remain sworn and qualified as a professional planner and a village planner. Agreed, Mr. Brunage?
Yes. Okay, to answer your question, give me one moment. So in general, I think you've raised a valid point. Yes, not all non-residential uses are created equal in terms of parking generation. Similarly, not all tenants of a particular use are created equal, in that some retail uses might generate more traffic, some restaurant uses might generate more traffic than others. But the heart of your question is, I think, should the planning board consider prohibition of certain uses, permitted uses in the building in order to preclude parking problems on the site? ultimately, I think I'm going to have to defer my comments to John Jar, since he's going to be better qualified to talk about the particular parking generation from specific uses. But in general, I think it's reasonable to conclude that there's a certain amount of flexibility that's built into a shared parking scenario, in terms of expecting that some non-residential uses may generate more traffic than others, but at some point there is a threshold that may create a parking issue for the community. But with that, I'm sorry to say, I'm going to have to defer to John Jar as to whether there's a certain threshold of a particular use, for example, that may be a problem.
Maybe I could just chime in just for a moment before. What I would point you to is to the traffic engineer's testimony and report that talked about the shared parking conditions. And I'm going to go through table 8 and 9 of that report, because it talks to what the surplus is of parking that's available as a result of the shared parking analysis that he presented. And this was given to the board. And I'm referring to table 8.
Is this the Bowman thingy?
Yes. And I understand our traffic engineers here further testify to this if he's needed, but I mean, it speaks for itself. If you look at table 8, proposed shared parking analysis weekday based on village RSIS parking standards. If you look at the time frame for the weekday from 7 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock, at no time is there a deficit. And then if you look at the surplus total or deficit total, they're all surpluses, 65, 72, 66, going down from 7 o'clock to 10, all the way, and they range from 65, 72 down to 58. That gives you the cushion where I think you have a situation where you have enough of a cushion where I don't necessarily think it's necessary nor advisable that you start handcuffing the application against putting in another permitted use like a restaurant. If we have this kind of a situation where you have a good surplus that could absorb some of that additional demand, because uses come and go as well. You could have retail one moment, you can have a restaurant another moment. There's always turnover in a downtown. And so it's a dynamic situation. And I think the focus of the board, and what I always advise is, how is the situation handled in this particular case? And what I'm suggesting respectfully to the board is, if you look at the shared parking analysis and the weekday, and I'll touch on the weekend, which is similar, you have a cushion built in that I think would address any overload or any additional demand that might occur as a result of a change in use that you may be concerned with. Again, table 9, if you look at Saturday, again, you've got from 7 in the morning to 10 at night, you have surpluses of parking spaces of 52, 49, 59, 43, going all the way down. Again, that cushion exists where you could absorb changes in use here without an impact. And that was, I think, the intent and purpose behind the incorporation of shared parking into the zoning ordinance in the first place, in the calculation of parking, because there was a desire to allow that flexibility, recognizing, as your master plan documents do, that we have a very transit-friendly community and a very transit-friendly village and a very transit-friendly location where you have the rail station, you have bus stops, you have a bus depot. All of that is working in favor of mitigating against traffic and parking. So again, and that's embodied in the documents and the analysis that the village went through a few years ago when it adopted the zoning in the first place. So I would encourage the board to consider the surplus as opposed to the deficit that currently exists as a cushion that I think is sufficient to absorb any change of use that you sir, would be concerned with.
John?
I've reviewed the parking extensively. Board, the parking analysis on this project is very, very technical. And it is quite extensive. And I've discussed it at length with Mr. Keller. I agree with the planner's testimony. There, in my opinion, there's going to exist a cushion of available parking. The retail amount is 9,731 square feet. Is that still accurate?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
Okay. This is where things could change, right? I think that the office is probably going to be pretty fixed. I think the residential units are definitely fixed. So the part that I think you're concerned with is that retail part. What exactly retail will it be? Will it be a five and dime? Will it be a restaurant? And of course, depending on what that turns out to be, that's where we need to have some flexibility in the parking. Okay, after our review of the parking, we feel that the amount of spaces are going to be provided based on, remember, they did what they call temporal distribution. Okay, so they look at the parking over a period of time and figure out how much per hour. All right, so that's why you have these two tables in here. It's a very comprehensive evaluation on an hour-by-hour basis of the amount of parking that they predict they're going to need and the amount of parking that's going to be available, and then they gave us the surplus or deficit table, and in every case, they come up with a surplus. I think the smallest surplus is 22 spaces during the noon hour, and we know that noon hour here is very tight for parking. We do have a lot of restaurants and retail business. A lot of folks go out for lunch, and so the noon hour is very, very busy. The other hour that things are a little tight again is the evening hour, again, dinner time. It seems but they are indicating they're going to have a 41 surplus. I feel that this gives us some flexibility and some factor of safety. So if there are changes within that retail piece, remember it's only 9,700 square feet, so if there are some changes in it, we can feel comfortable that they're not going to create another overpark situation. Currently now, there's sometimes it's hard to find parking over there. Does that answer the question? Does it help?
Yeah, I'm just going to do some simple math. So if we have a 60-seat restaurant and some of the ordinances that are in and around this area say for every 2 seats you need 1 parking place. So let's assume that at 60-seat restaurant you need 30 spots. That's the first. And then let's assume, just as kind of a worst-case scenario, we put a realtor goes in there. And so a realtor, they typically have, 30 cars at any point in time with the realtors. So you're squeezing up against that number with not much wiggle room. And I guess that's what concerns me is that I don't know if you'd have enough if you looked at a kind of a worst-case scenario. I guess I'd asked that you guys did this before at the last meeting, and there was no analysis that was done. I'm actually surprised that you didn't do it. So I'm still concerned about it.
Excuse me, there was no analysis of what, sir?
I had asked for you guys to look at a worst-case scenario on this. Okay, looking at the worst case as far as the types of businesses that would go in there the last meeting. And Mr. Burnage, I think you kind of blew me off.
Excuse me?
I think you blew me off on this. You just kind of poo-pooed it.
Well, the record will speak for itself. I resent you suggesting that I would blow you or any other member of the board off, sir. But nonetheless, I would suggest to you that the answer provided by the planner this evening in detail, referencing the traffic report, addresses what you have described as worst case, a very subjective word, but I don't know what worst case is. You can conjure up, I suppose, all sorts of horrific conditions, whatever your purpose might be. But nonetheless, I think the question's been adequately answered.
I'm not satisfied with it, so thank you.
Dave, do you have questions for Mr. Zabo? Susan?
I'm good right now.
Okay. Francis?
No, I don't.
Melanie? Joel? Okay, I don't. Beth, do you have any questions for Mr. Zabo?
I don't have any questions. I think that he went through the criteria properly and addressed the variances. I'm happy to answer any questions that the board members may have, though.
Okay. Chris, did you have any questions?
None at this time, thank you.
Okay. John, did you have any questions?
No questions.
Okay. Okay. Does anyone from the public want to ask questions of Mr. Zabo, the planner? Oh, here's a... No, I meant you. You were standing there. Pulling a head fake there. Okay. All right, seeing there's no one from the public. All right, we'll move on to... you have no other witnesses?
If no other witnesses to call, we would respectfully request that the board take the matter under consideration and move the matter to a vote. I think that the record is replete with the facts that support the requested variance relief as well as waiver relief. I think that the positive and negative criteria have been laid out in great detail by Mr. Zabo, and I think that there's every reason under the municipal land use law, your local ordinance, and the case law to grant the relief requested, which of course would be the variance is applied for, the waivers applied for, preliminary and final site plan approval, and hopefully a positive vote with respect to the major soil movement permit as well.
Okay.
We thank you for your time and attention.
We're going to move on to our professionals. Beth, did you want to give a report?
Sure. So as was referenced in testimony just a little while ago, I issued a report on April 11th of this year. Many of the comments throughout this report have actually been addressed by the applicant throughout the throughout the 4 hearings on this application. Notwithstanding, I'll go through and address, give an overview and address any outstanding items. Section 1, of course, is project description. No commentary necessary. Section 2 is zoning compliance, and in this section, it identifies the items of noncompliance that the applicant was referencing during their planning testimony, and also gives the board background as to what the zoning requires and what the applicant is proposing. As stated, they do require a number of number of variances and exceptions that are identified in here. But for once again, a summary, the applicant is seeking relief from the maximum building height. However, since this is before the planning board, it is within 10% of the maximum permitted in the zone district, and so as such, this is a C variance rather than a D variance. They're also seeking relief for parking space number, parking space location, in terms of whether it's located in the front yard setback along Franklin. Also, screening for the parking in terms of where it's located beneath the building. And lastly, for relief for the retaining wall setback and also the height of it. And so each of those items are enumerated in Section 2. Also included in Section 2 is a reference to the affordable housing being proposed. I'm satisfied that the applicant has the ability to and intends to meet all of the applicable requirements to ensure that the village gets affordable housing credit for this project, which of course is one of the underlying purposes of the master plan policy that was put in place for the B3R district. Moving on to Section 3, this provides the statutory criteria for granting a C variance. For those that might be thinking back to Mr. Zabo's planning testimony, this may be a good reference. And Section 4 provides architectural commentary. And in this section, I provided a series of 13 comments on the architecture. However, if you take a look at this memo, all of the items had been satisfied with the exception, or noted as satisfied with the exceptions of item 4.1, 2, and 5. 4.1, and I'm sorry to say 4.2 because it was simply repeated, simply requested that the applicant provide architectural samples and detailed information about what was being proposed in terms of renderings to give the board a better idea of the appearance of the buildings. That was done during testimony. 4.5 requested that the applicant provide additional clarity as to the materials for the 5th floor. That was actually done on sheet A9, and so that comment now too has been satisfied. Section 5, plantings. All of these comments have been satisfied. We recommended a number of changes in regards to plant species, plant locations, and so forth. Section 6, lighting. The applicant has indicated that they will meet the village land use ordinance, and with that, that satisfies the majority of satisfies my concerns. The applicant, the one final item is that I believe they've indicated that the lighting plan will be revised to eliminate any light spillover to surrounding properties. Yes.
I believe that was the testimony. Is that correct, Mike? Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm. And so with that, that closes out the lighting section. Second to last section is, of course, parking and circulation. These items have been addressed in the sense that either they're simply items of relief that they've agreed to request and have provided planning testimony on, or they've indicated that they'll be satisfied. So, for example, vehicle clearance was addressed via testimony, indicating that emergency vehicles will not be going underneath or within the parking garage, and site triangles will be provided on a final plan. The last item of substance, last section of substance is the refuse disposal area, and that final comment has been satisfied. So, as such, my report has been addressed by the applicant either through making amendments to the plan or going ahead and requesting the relief identified therein. And so with that, I'm open to any questions.
Okay, thanks, Beth. Jeff, did you have questions for Beth?
No.
Dave?
No.
Susan?
Yes. Could you go back to 7.2 on the curbing, on the parking? Could you just... go through, kind of walk us through that again?
Item 7.2, curbs. This is on page 11 of the report. As the applicant have requested, they're seeking relief from section 190-80, which requires that all parking areas be bound by curbing. However, there are several places within their parking area that doesn't include that. And so as a result, they of course need relief. The testimony that was provided is because this is a, if I can paraphrase, a bit of an unusual parking situation in that this is not your typical surface parking lot where all of the parking spaces serving the development are on one level, and as a result of that, and as a result of the configuration of the lot, they've removed some curbing in order to better facilitate vehicle movement in a safe manner and convenient manner for the motorists. Does that answer your question?
I guess I'm asking your position, your position on that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood the question. I'm comfortable with the relief for the curbing. Although, to be fair, I see it, while whether or not relief will be granted is certainly a planning jurisdiction, since it requires relief, and so they need to meet the criteria. Notwithstanding, whether or not a parking area requires curbing is largely a concern for engineering and traffic engineering to ensure safe vehicle circulation and truck turning movements. I've heard no objection from either your board traffic engineer or your board engineer, and so that combined with my review of the plans makes me comfortable with the relief requested.
So technically, Beth, it's not a variance, it's a design waiver?
Correct.
Okay. All right, and just on another note, and it's not addressed in here, but it was a conversation that came up regarding design and the I guess the north-facing, south-facing, and west-facing walls that are essentially blank. And I don't think anyone's ever spoken to those design elements, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that were, even though it's not in here. I think it's a huge building, and it's extremely visible, towering over everything. It will be very visible from a variety of sides, and the only finished side is the front. So did you have any commentary on that?
Yeah, I do think that the applicant had made some improvements to the architecture of the plans on those particular building facades, adding some additional detailing. While there's certainly no ignoring the fact that they're not treated the same as the front facade, I am comfortable with the architecture of those building facades, and I say that because while they will be visible from the surrounding area, they're certainly not the prominent feature, and I expect that there are going to be intervening buildings within sight from many locations. So as you're looking perhaps down Ridgewood Avenue towards the site, the back of the building is not going to be your primary view of the building, for example. Similarly, if you're looking at the back of the building from a parking lot, from an interior parking lot, I have less concern over the aesthetics of that building since it's not going to be visible from that location from the public right-of-way. And so, in sum, I think it's reasonable to have lesser architectural detailing on secondary facades than it is the primary facade, and I'm comfortable that the applicant has made the movements towards improving the architecture that they did, so that there is some visual interest. There's a change of materials and some other items that they've done to try to try to cut down or reduce the mass of the building wall in those areas.
Okay. All right, I'm good.
Francis?
I don't have any questions.
Melanie?
No, I think my couple of questions were answered just now.
Okay, Joel?
A couple quick questions. The applicant's planner described the site conditions a couple different ways. One time he said they're less than perfect, other time he said they're extreme and exceptional, specifically when he's talking about the C1 variance. How would you describe the site as a planner? Because does it meet the C1 criteria as an exceptional? I think it's a subjective term. I want to know your opinion on it as a planner.
As to whether or not it meets the C1 criteria?
Correct.
The site is awkwardly shaped. That's certainly true. And I think part of what the planner's testimony was trying to achieve is highlighting the fact that in a regularly shaped lot, if we're thinking about a rectangular square, it's certainly easier to achieve setback requirements, for example. I think some of those variances that had been referenced at that time were in terms of the retaining wall setback and the parking screening in part. In terms of the parking screening, I certainly think that, and this is the parking along Franklin Avenue, I think the C1 criteria is a good fit for that, because that is an awkward portion of the property. It's a dog leg, so to speak, if we can use that term of art. I certainly think that's reasonable to apply the C1 variance criteria. For some of these other C1 variances that were referenced, such as the retaining wall, I also find that reasonable because of some of the other, because in part, the property shape along the rear is one of the more awkward property lines. As you can see, there's a jog between lot 8.01 and lot 6 on the property. And so that awkward configuration can yield awkward site improvements, such as a retaining wall that's too close to the property line. I think that's reasonable to apply the C1 variance criteria to.
Beth, can I bother you to just speak into the microphone?
I'm
Because
sorry.
I'm having a little bit
I'm
of...
sorry.
Yeah.
And for those similar reasons, as stated with the retaining wall setback in terms of that property line jog between lots 8.01 and lot 6, for those reasons, I think it's also reasonable to apply the C1 criteria to the parking setback, since those are the locations where we've got the 2.14 and 3.16 parking setback variances that are being applied for as well.
Okay, thanks.
I have no questions. Tom, did you have any questions?
Not of Mrs. McAdams, no.
Anyone from the public have any questions for the planner? Okay, seeing there none. Okay, we'll move on. Chris, do you want to provide a report?
Let's see, I did a review. I believe the applicant has concurred with most of my observations. I think the key challenge going forward will be having the applicant as a party with the village and county in improving that corridor between East Ridgewood Avenue and Franklin along Maple. As I mentioned earlier, we don't know what it's going to be. It's going to be a long, drawn-out process, and I look forward to working with the applicant in improving that corridor. That's it.
Jeff, do you have any questions for Chris at all?
No, I do not, thank you. If that question was to me, excuse me, I'm sorry. I was busy writing.
Oh, that's okay. Chris was just providing a report. I was just seeing if Jeff had any questions for Chris.
Yeah, and Chris, this is your August 14th report, right? You were referring to? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good. So you had some issues with environmental issues?
Yes, the subject site is unfortunately towards the receiving end of a plume that originates on Chestnut Street.
Okay.
They are aware of it. They'll have to address it accordingly.
You also mentioned there was a vent pipe, there may be an underground storage tank there. Did you, is that right or no?
I haven't investigated that further. When demolition occurs, if there is a UST there, the applicant will have to get the requisite permits from the building and fire department to remove it.
Okay. And then you had some of the things on the site plan. You requested the applicant show how pedestrian movements would safely occur for the development in the public. Does that need to be addressed?
That's going to be a tricky thing with the county because they may encroach a little bit on the sidewalk for vehicle movement, yet we still want to maintain a reasonable thoroughfare for pedestrians.
Okay. And then you also talked about snow and ice removal. Did we talk about that or no?
I don't recall what testimony the applicant gave on that. A lot of their parking is covered, so that should be a more minor issue than some of the other locations.
Okay. Yeah, sanitary service, sanitary sewer service. You mentioned something about the NJDEP sewer extension approval?
They'll have to file a TWA, Treatment Works Approval, if their projected flow exceeds the regulatory threshold. I don't recall if that number is 8,000 or 9,000 gallons a day.
Okay, and then they're going to provide you with some anticipated flow volumes from the site, I guess? Is that?
Yes, that's going to be part of determining whether they have to prepare Treatment Works Approval for the site.
Okay. Oh, and then the other thing you mentioned, there was an 8-inch diameter sanitary sewer connection. It needs to be changed to a 10-inch?
Let's see, from the project to it.
It's the fourth bullet point down. Oh, fifth bullet point down, I'm sorry.
Yeah, because I just said they should be done with a manhole rather than a Y as shown on drawing C-5.
Okay.
That's a recommendation.
Yeah, I think that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dave?
No questions.
Susan?
Mine were just asked, too.
Okay, great. Francis?
I have no questions.
Melanie?
Just quickly, I believe the last hearing you had said something about the sidewalk and the amount of traffic coming in through it, and the line that ran underneath the sidewalk was going to be taking some kind of, like, some amount of extra weight or work or traffic that would cause you to have concern about it, off of Ridgewood Ave, I believe?
I think...
Sorry, never mind. Was that you?
I think you're referring to the storm drainage line on the western periphery of the site that runs to East Ridgewood Avenue. There is a storm drain line. I did make a mention of it in my review memo. It is relatively shallow, and I made the recommendation that no heavy equipment be operated in its vicinity to avoid a failure of that line. Is that what you're referring to?
I believe so, but I think it was answered now, actually.
Okay. I mean, again, that's something that we're aware of, the applicant should be aware of, and the construction operations should take it into consideration.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Joel?
No questions for Chris.
Okay, I have no questions. Tom, did you have any questions for Chris?
No, I don't. Not at this time. Thank you.
Okay. I guess, John, we kind of had your report. Did you have anything to add?
I have nothing further.
Did anyone have any further questions for John Jar at all? Okay. Tom, did you have questions for?
No, I don't.
Does anyone from the public have any questions for John Jar? And I don't think I asked for Chris. Did anyone, for Chris Rudhauser, did anyone for the public have any questions for Chris Rudhauser? Okay, seeing there none. Okay. I guess a motion to open up to public comment would be the next step on this. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, Melanie, so Joel, and then Melanie. Call the roll, Michael?
Mayor Knutson,
Yes.
Councilman Voigt,
Yes.
Mr. Torrielli,
Yes.
Ms. McWilliams,
Yes.
Mr. Scheibner,
Yes.
Mr. Joel,
Yes.
Ms. Bartow.
Yes.
Is there anyone from the public that wants to make a comment on this project? All right, seeing there none. I guess you can provide a summation now. If you have
Said it
anything.
all.
Okay, all right, so nothing further to add. All right, so we're going to come down to a decision time, and we can discuss it now, or if people feel that they have to take the information in and review it and put it for another meeting, let's have input. Jeff, do you have input on how you want to proceed?
Yeah, I'm still worried about the shared parking issue. I'm just not comfortable with it, to be honest with you. I mean, I gotta think about it. I don't know, I guess that means I gotta think about it, so.
Dave, did you have?
If we don't deliberate and vote tonight, when would we do that? At the next meeting?
When would be the next open meeting for, do you know?
The next meeting would be the second meeting in January. I mean, the first meeting is open, but it's, I've talked to KS Broad 2 for that date, but that's something that, you know, we can move and put you on for that.
Did you have a feeling one way or the other?
That's a long time.
Yeah.
I'm willing to go ahead tonight.
Okay. Susan, did you have?
Yeah, I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say.
Okay. Francis?
I'm comfortable with moving ahead. I mean, we've heard a lot of testimony here, so.
Okay. Melanie?
I think I'd like to think about it as well, but I also think it's been a long time. I'm not 100% sure if much else can be answered by waiting, other than, I mean, maybe some more information from the county, but beyond that, I'd go ahead tonight as well.
Okay. Joel?
I'm happy to deliberate tonight as well.
So am I. I'm happy to deliberate tonight. Okay. Can we just have a motion to formally close the meeting and then enter into deliberations?
Motion to close the hearing.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, Melanie's a second. Call the roll, Michael, to close the meeting.
Mayor Knudsen,
Yes.
Councilman Voigt,
Is this to deliberate tonight, is that the,
Yeah.
no?
Mr. Torrielli,
Yes.
Ms. McWilliams,
Yes.
Mr. Scheibner,
Yes.
Mr. Joel,
Yes.
Ms. Bartow.
Yes.
Okay, the motion carried. We're going to deliberate now. All right, I guess we'll start with discussions. Jeff, do you want to give your input?
Yeah, I mentioned I'm concerned about the shared parking in that area, and the intensity of use of any kind of commercial entity that goes in there. And, you know, unless it's a lower intensity of use type of business, it can, my thinking, it would create an issue as far as parking in that area. And, you know, any kind of shared parking cushion that we have anytime during the day, I mean, again, it depends upon the intensity of use. My preference would be, is it a stipulation you put in there that they have to be certain types of businesses that wouldn't create a tremendous amount of demand for parking in that area. So, you know, I think if that stipulation was put in place, I'd be comfortable in moving forward and saying yes. But unless if it isn't, I'm uncomfortable, to be honest with you. So.
Let's see if that's feasible. John, do they ever have stipulations limiting the type of use to cut down on the traffic and parking?
There definitely have been, where a land use board can, say that certain uses are permitted in a property. I think that this is more of a question for Beth, isn't it? Wouldn't,
Yeah, it may be. I'm familiar with projects that have a mix of uses, whether it's mixed commercial or mixed residential or so forth, that prohibit some or more of the permitted uses from being tenants in a property. That certainly occurred in other projects.
Okay. Would a restaurant be the most intensive use for the parking?
The thing here is they're providing as much as 61 spaces for, all right, so it's a 9,700 square foot retail space, and they're providing as many as 61 spaces. I mean, even if it was a high turnover restaurant, it doesn't need that many parking spaces. So the number of spaces which are available to that use, if you take what they provided for retail and add the surplus, I can't think of a use other than, maybe a medical use, make a medical office. Sometimes smaller medical offices have a tremendous parking demand. We've done studies in this, actually the smaller the medical office, the more parking they need. It's crazy, but that's how it works. From a retail perspective, I don't think medical office would be allowed. Beth, would medical be allowed in this space?
I know, that's a B1, the front seal bonds part is still B1.
Right.
B2, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
B2.
press.
Right, so B2, so go ahead.
Yeah, to the mayor's point, what the board can consider is the prior site use as seal ponds had a stipulation, if I recall, in an approval resolution that any change of use had to come before this board. Even as simple as changing from small business office to, say, a real estate office, they had to come back to this board. I know the applicant's attorney at that time, Chuck Collins, groused about it frequently, and we saw them frequently whenever there was like a tenancy change. That is something possibly that the board could consider.
I'd be okay with that.
Yeah, I think my recollection is they came for the bank. Did
They came for
They
PNC,
came for the
they came
PNC
for
bank,
Remax.
everything thus
Yes.
far. I think everything. So if that's how the language.
That may give the board the oversight of review of the tenancies that you're seeking in seeing how you're concerned with the parking.
As opposed to the residential component, which they would not have to come back when there's a change of tenancy.
Right.
It would be
No.
commercial.
It would just be for the commercial
Yeah.
portion of the project.
That's actually very close to what NJDOT does with their driveway permits, that anytime there's a change of use, it has to come back for them for either a letter of no interest or a new driveway application. That's just very, that's a pretty reasonable approach, I think.
One of my boards has people come back when there's a change of a CO, when there's a new tenant, so it's kind of common.
Yeah.
And I mean, doing this then kind of leaves it open to a conversation without tying the hands of the property owner and being so restrictive. So you would be able to then have a conversation and they would be able to put forth a plan as to how they would deal with those parking constraints then. Okay.
And I think Beth would agree, and Mr. Brunage would probably say, if one then comes back, the law still applies, then the board is constrained in certain regards as to whether they can do anything or not, but consistent.
Yes, absolutely.
It'd be interesting to see how you handle that resolution, Chris, because you don't want to prevent, or you don't want to create just a free-for-all where we say, okay, it can't be a pizzeria, or it could be a restaurant, or it could be a dance studio. It's like, you have to, it can't be totally subjective, right? What the uses are.
Well, the last 5 minutes of conversation were, if there's a change in use, I didn't hear what is allowed yet.
Correct.
Unless, it's allowed under the zone, and I would, again, I've been speaking for Mr. Brunage a lot tonight, but I would imagine if it's allowed under the zone, he would want the opportunity to have that.
So, but, I mean,
We want to be
benefits of B3R zoning, the answer is of course.
That's what he would say.
But can't you use other standards? I mean, we don't have it in our town, but other towns have standards as to, you know, the number of parking places per restaurant seat. So couldn't we use that as kind of a baseline?
But we can actually, as part of just our own efforts to mitigate the parking situation, is we always have the option to advance different zoning rules and regulations and ordinances that whatever moves into the future. So if something's grandfathered in, then it would not apply. But we certainly have the option to change zoning and add that. What you're looking for is in terms of X number of seats in a restaurant, you want to see one spot for every 2 seats, whatever that formula is that you want to use. We always have the option to adopt that kind of zoning. So, I mean, and that would be something we should likely consider fairly soon and aggressively.
Do you have any other thoughts or discussion points?
I still kind of like Chris's idea. I mean, if they decide to come up with another tenant, then we get the opportunity to review it and just consider it. You know, I don't think it's necessarily going to. I don't think it's going to create a lot of hardship, to be honest with you. I mean, and it's going to allow us to you know, to think about whether or not it can you know, the parking can accommodate whatever type of business it is. I just don't see I don't see this as such a detriment. So.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think we could still put that in. Yeah. I'm saying still do that, but I'm saying do that on this as part of a stipulation. But for future, sure, we can say we can adopt different zoning rules and regulations that would address those parking issues that are of concern. So we would do that, what you're suggesting, as a stipulation, as part of the resolution, if that's where we're going, and then address the other issues in a more timely fashion.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Dave, did you have any questions, comments, or thoughts?
I also had issues with the parking, but the concept of the shared parking doesn't bother me. But what does bother me is that a number of the parking spaces that are being used for this are not meeting the standard. They're only 18 feet deep. And on level 1 of the building, the first floor, where quite a bit of the residential parking is located, there are 3 apartments that have no view except for the parking on that level. One of them is even under the canopy of the upper floors. And I think design-wise, I don't think there was enough effort put into putting more parking spaces on the first floor. So if the parking along the driveway off of Franklin was parallel parking instead, and you eliminated these apartments that have no view except for the cars parked outside their wall, it seems like you could have plenty of parking and have a better overall plan. The other variances I don't have any problems with.
All right, Susan?
So the 18-foot stall meets the standard, right? It's a design exemption, but it meets the residential standard? 9 by 18.
Yeah, 9 by 18 standard.
It does. Yeah. It's good, just, I'm asking a question, yes, right? It does?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
9 by 18 is standard stall size.
Right. So I agree with you, and I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know if there's 2 things that I would be concerned with is that piece. I would like to see a stipulation that brings back to just a small review committee or somebody what the back and the sides of the building is going to be like. I'd like to see some final design on that. To Dave's point, what can we do to address that? How would we?
The design of the architectural component.
That's one piece, but to Dave's point about his concerns about the stalls and that overhang, because I guess those units are kind of locked into, that one in particular, is that what you're pointing out right there?
Okay, the northernmost, let's call it the northwest corner apartment on the first floor, more than 50% of their exterior wall that could possibly have windows is covered by the overhang. And the rest of their view is 3 parking spaces. It's like a cheap hotel, yeah. It's just the other 2 western apartments on that floor, you know, at least there's a sky above. But it just doesn't seem like a good design to me.
Well, maybe, Dave, what you're saying is they could, and kind of my feeling, they could achieve their objective of developing the site and developing residential property there and do a lot of this as of right without some of these variances. I mean, they could increase the parking if they got rid of that ridiculous unit. So, I mean, the height thing, screening the parking, like, I think they could achieve a lot of these things. That's where, you know, I'm struggling a little bit. The C1, I kind of see that, but they could achieve a lot of their objectives and as of right, and be here for a site plan review as opposed to, I lost count, at least 8 variances, probably missing some. That's where I'm struggling with the application.
Just one, on this issue, Mr. Brunage, I think we can get this off the table so it's consistent. Most of the applications that are similar in terms of the multi-family housing issues, they require integrated housing for the low to moderate income persons. That is different in this situation based upon what see Mr. Toronto is here. So these particular units would not be part of anything in terms of the developmentally disabled people.
The quotes-unquote affordable housing is going to be presented on site for the benefit of this project as well as the KS Broad project, and that's the 8 special needs units, 15 beds located in the, I forget the square footage area of the old Seal Funds building that's being converted.
So this would be, the ones that Dave and Joel just brought up would be market value units.
Yeah, I'm not exactly certain what the gentlemen which units they were referring to, but nonetheless, whatever they were referring to units that are on the site plan and in the architectural plans.
But not for any required.
They're not. It's not affordable. Those are not affordable in that building. That's correct.
Yeah, so I thought it was pretty straightforward, but yes, I just wanted to confirm that. Okay.
Yeah.
I think the question for me is, look, if somebody has a business plan, this is just, you know, it's just the real world. Somebody has a business plan. In their business plan, they've incorporated an apartment that is stuck in the middle of an overhang and is looking at a bunch of parking spaces. If that business plan includes renting that unit out, well, then maybe their business plan isn't great and that unit won't get rented out. So that's just maybe bad design, and that will be the burden of a developer. Your question as to whether or not, you know, maybe that was a question, you know, 2 meetings ago, in terms of just the stall size, I think is more relevant, because, like I said, if somebody wants to offer up an apartment that's bad, then nobody's going to rent it. Nobody's going to pay rent, or they won't get their money out of it, right?
And I understand that. The reason I bring up the deficiencies of those particular apartments is because they are directly adjacent to the parking area, and they could have been considered as being part of the parking area.
Right.
So instead of building 3 difficult-to-rent apartments, why didn't they just make the parking bigger?
Right.
And eliminate some of this issue with how many parking spaces there are.
Right, which I guess was I mean, I guess it would have been a great question to pose for, the architect at the time.
I think Debbie and I did pose the question about those units facing the parking at the time. I think we both brought it up at some point back in the beginning, on like the first day of hearing that. And I think also, I want to say Debbie asked, if the parking spots were made to the 2 feet bigger that they need to be, how much more deficient would the parking actually end up being? I don't know if that ever got answered.
So is that something that can be stipulated as part of the approval? Is that the parking, those stalls be modified? Is that something that we, entertain?
It's a good question, Mayor, but stipulation inherently means there's someone on the other side of the
Well, if you're asking the applicant whether the applicant's going to stipulate to conditions other than expressed in the application and in the plans, the applications before you under the municipal land use law and under your ordinance requires you to make a decision based on the proofs that have been put before you.
I know.
I understand how everyone has his or her own view of the perceived beauty, the perceived appropriateness of the aesthetics. I suppose there are more than enough opinions that are beyond the number of people in this room as to whether or not a project is financially worthwhile and conceivable. The simple fact of the matter is it's the applicant that's putting his capital at risk. The simple fact of the matter is the responsibility of the board under the municipal land use law is to go forward and take the evidence that's been presented to you and render a decision on the application based on the evidence that's presented. And I suggest to you that the evidence has been overwhelmingly in support of the relief sought and requested. Your planner agrees with that. Your traffic consultant agrees with that. And I think the application is what it is. It's as simple as that. If a unit is required to rent for a few dollars less than other units in the building, that should be of absolutely no concern to this board. As a matter of fact, it being a concern of the board should be a concern to you.
One thing that was mentioned by the mayor was what was done with, I believe, one of the principals for your client's KS building, which was there would be a subcommittee in terms of final architectural approval.
I have no idea what's happened with the KS Broad application. It's not my client.
No, I'm not saying that, but it is the board's decision tonight too, so it's a consideration. Mr. Saraceno was involved with another matter that there was advice and counsel by some members that was approved for the design and the ultimate construction, which was sort of a good faith opportunity. If your client wants to foreclose any discussion at this point, that's fine.
No one suggested we're foreclosing discussion. I'm sitting here listening and being happy to respond to comments, questions, suggestions, but I have no knowledge of what you're speaking of, so I can't talk about it.
Well, maybe your client can.
Maybe he can. I don't know.
Well, what he's saying, you can ask.
It's something to consider. I mean, if you're telling the board you're not going to consider it, we're not going to consider it. Then I'll tell the board they're not considering it.
Okay.
No, I don't. I think Mr. Saraceno is going to approach it. He wants to vote.
Do I have to be sworn in or something like that? Because I don't want to do anything wrong at this point.
You know what? You are an applicant, so if you don't mind, raise your right hand.
Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
And just identify your name and address, that's all.
John Saraceno, 17 Coventry Court. I'm the managing partner of 257 Ridgewood Avenue, the owner of this property. Your issue, Mr. Schreiber. So, like everything, this drawing started 8.5 years ago. We're still doing this drawing. I don't like that unit either. I don't like the other two. The other two to the left don't bother me as much. The one that you reference all the way to the north is the one I dislike. We've actually toyed with and looking at, on the top floor, there is a balcony off to the southern side of the top floor, and exchanging that unit be common area, make the top floor unit, which is currently a balcony, into a unit. But like everything, these things progress over time, and we're not ignorant to the fact that that's going to be a tough unit. It would not actually increase parking as designed, because it would actually end up being a fairly awkward spot, because we wouldn't lose all 3 units. The economics of it wouldn't work if we lost 3 units. And the other 2 units, in my opinion, are fairly commonplace for what they are. The one that's under the overhang is obviously the most complicated one. We're sensitive to it, and we're not ignorant to it, but we can't keep giving you guys different drawings every time we come up with a different idea, because you'd lose your mind just like we do. But we understand it. As to the architectural details, like is the case with KS, we did agree that, but we all know that that application has now been superseded by a new application which addresses many of the architectural details, because we did have an open dialogue about it. As it relates to the other fascias that you're talking about, we've played with it. As a resident, I'm equally sensitive to it. I want to build something that's nice. I have no I'm not looking to build something that doesn't respect the site and respect the village. But it is sort of like, 3 units that you would say would be lovely as additional parking. I'm not disagreeing with you. In a non-economic environment, that would probably be nice to make them more parking and lose 3 units, but we can't afford to lose 3 units. It's just, the economics of it don't work. But I'm more than happy to engage in a conversation. Subcommittees and the term scare the heck out of me. But I'm more than happy to sit with the mayor and anybody else who would like to sit with me, and for that matter, anybody in the planning board that would like to sit with me in an informal way and discuss it and show them some of the finishes. We have not finished the design of the outside of the building. This is a site plan application. It's not construction drawings of a building. We haven't completed the bidding process to see what we can afford to do. If I can make the back as nice as the front, I'll do it. I mean, we're not looking to skimp it by any stretch. So I'm more than happy to. I prefer not to have a formal subcommittee, but as I think I've been from the beginning of this process, if someone has an idea, I'm more than happy to listen to it, and I'll engage in the conversation. So if that satisfies the board, I hope it does, but I don't want to get into something that makes a condition of subcommittees and a lot of different opinions, because it gets kind of difficult.
Okay, thanks. Do you have any more questions or comments?
Point of order, Rich, did we reopen the hearing? So we're kind of hearing more testimony?
No, that was more kind of a dialogue on it, just to see what the applicant was going to... He was responding in the place of Tom Brunage, so it was just facilitating that. Any more comments, Susan? Or? Okay. All right, Francis, do you have any comments?
There's been a lot of discussion about parking, and I think it's an issue that we've been dealing with in many different applications. Councilman Voigt, I do agree. I have concerns about the non-residential parking and the potential uses of the various tenants coming and going, and I like Mr. Martin's idea of putting some language in the resolution that would apprise us as a board of what types of tenants are going into these spaces, so we have some control over, do we have a bigger problem, than has been presented here.
Ellie?
I don't have much else to add, except I share everybody's similar concerns. I don't know that I agree that I think putting in a resolution, this language is really going to be the answer. I think it maybe even kind of confuses or muddies things more. I would really love to see the math behind it, if the parking spaces were made to code, because it's a variance there too. How many more deficient we'd be. I'm stuck on just even that at the moment, so I don't have anything else to say right now.
Is the stall size a variance or a design?
I thought that the parking was a variance.
Parking is a variance, the stall size, I think.
The stall size, I thought, was a design.
Yeah, it's a design exemption.
It's not a variance, right. I think that's an important distinction that we need to be clear about.
Joel?
I would want some sort of look back on the parking situation as part of any kind of approval. Yeah, we all look at, you know, the accepted calculations and all that, and then I think some of us feel like the reality may be different than what's in a book for our village. So I'd like a look back, and I don't know what that could do for us if we were to look back at it after it's built. I feel like at that point, it kind of has that much teeth, but it's something. So I'd be in favor of at least that being part of the resolution.
Okay, I have similar concerns with the parking. I think that additional language would help. I mean, you're making efforts for that. Also, the architectural details is important to me in that you have a nice front, and I think it should be nice on the other sides that are visible, because it's kind of a landmark building for the town, I think. Very viewable, driving along, you know, North Maple, Ridgewood Ave, and all around there. So, you know, I would like to see it be the best it can be. All right, does anyone want to make a motion or have more discussion?
What kind of language do we use if we wanted to have a review of a final plan? How would we actually, what kind of language? Because I know what the applicant is saying is he doesn't want a formal review, but, oh, I'm sorry. So I know that the applicant is saying he doesn't want a formal review, but what kind of language would we use in a resolution that opens up that conversation to a final product being reviewed?
I think the case, as Broad had, wasn't it, you were designated?
Yeah, I believe that resolution did designate or require that the applicant work with my office to identify certain architectural revisions. Perhaps we could parrot that language should the board be inclined to issue an approval for this application.
And then Beth's free to contact us, you know, either we can have a small committee or just input on it, but, you know, she can be the conduit, I think.
Small committee different than subcommittee?
Actually, she could just report to the board if there are any more comments. It could be no committee, it could be an architect's concern, so that'd be good.
Okay.
Okay, is anyone going to make a motion on this application at all?
Yeah, I can make a motion to approve based on the following stipulations, and please add them in if I forget. One of them is that, you know, the types of businesses that are in the non-residential uses, we are able to at least evaluate to see what their intensity of use is as the businesses turn over, just to make sure that we're comfortable with the, you know, with the parking and the shared parking. The other one relates to, and maybe this is on a periodic basis, I don't know what it is, maybe every couple of years or so, as we look at the residents that are in each of these units to see what the parking demand is for those particular units themselves. And if those stipulations, did I miss anything on the parking? No?
No, you're good.
Okay, so if those stipulations are put in, I would make a motion to approve the application.
Jeff, could you repeat the second one for me? The first one is the review
review of any change of commercial business.
Yeah, and the other one is on a, I don't know what that time frame is, but us to be able to look at least the residents who are in the residential units to see what the parking demand is for those particular units.
So,
How many cars they have or whatever.
we need to have our traffic consultant review within 6 months after the final CO is issued as to the parking and if there's any adjustments that need to be recorded.
Yeah, and then maybe over time, maybe it's every, I don't know, every couple of years or something like that, just so that if there's turnover in the units, we understand if there's an increase or decrease in demand of the parking based on the change in the units.
I don't think you can do it in perpetuity, but maybe we'll do maybe we do a look back in 6 months, 1 year, and then we're done.
That's fine.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, that's
And then we
fine.
want the, so we also want to put Beth as the conduit for those design, to address those concerns, and also for those architectural details.
Is that okay? That's appended to your motion there?
Sure, absolutely, that's fine.
The second part with the look back would be the traffic consultant, that would be Mr. Jar.
Mhm.
And the third one, which is the designer, would work in conjunction with the applicant as to architectural review of plans and furtherance of the zone and the master plan and the board comments.
Will the resolution identify that any one or more board members will also participate in the architectural review?
I would like it to.
I'm happy to perform that work on behalf of the board, but I think that type of input works best when at least one board member is there to provide their input and give the rest of the board some confidence that your views as represented by other board members will be discussed in the meeting.
Or I would actually say two board, I
At
almost
least
feel
one.
like it needs to be two board members, so,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's kind of critical so that flow of information, and I guess would serve to allay any concerns that have been expressed here, and I think that the concerns should be considered seriously. So maybe that is the mechanism for that dialogue.
Is there certain board members that you want for that?
Well, I nominate Joel. And I'm happy to be on that and work with Joel on it.
Are you
If that
willing?
would be okay with it. If that's okay with everyone.
Sounds like you're volunteering.
Sorry, I mean, it's up to you. You could step away. I mean, it's not a big issue.
I was just teasing him. Okay, so is there anything else on that motion, Jeff, that you wanted to add? So it's the architectural details and the parking language. Is there anything else that we have?
Dave, do you want extra windows?
No? Okay. All right,
I'm
so
just
Jeff
kidding, no.
stated his motion. Do you want to just review it quickly? Just again, so everyone hears it as one motion?
Okay, so the motion to approve based on the stipulations of parking evaluation of non-residential uses when they turn over, evaluation of residential uses at a 6 month and 1 year time frame, and then a subcommittee to work with Beth on the architectural design of the building itself. So does that hit everything?
Yeah. I
Okay,
think
that's
so.
the motion to approve.
Okay. Do we have a second on it?
I'll second.
Okay, Susan, second. Okay, Michael, call the roll.
Mayor Knutson,
Yes.
Mr. Scheibner,
No.
Councilman Voigt,
Yes.
Mr. Torrielli,
Yes.
Mr. Joel,
Yes.
Ms. McWilliams,
No.
Ms. Bartow.
Yes.
Motion carries. It's approved with those conditions and stipulations.
I look forward to seeing the resolution.
Okay, congratulations, Steve.
I'm very happy.
Oh,
When was the last time we voted and we didn't commentary? I would have added 50 I think if they were, I was able to comment
We were
later.
just doing our comments before, I think that's,
Well, there's no, DVAR. You don't need, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to have, this is not how we've done it before, like the vote. I feel like we just all sat here and wrote the resolution.
Are we done? Are we taking a?
And I didn't realize that was how that was
Mr.
going.
Chairman.
Previously, when we voted, I feel like
Well, the resolution has been done and then approved.
But at a second, not
No.
at a second. But now I can't vote on the resolution, and I would have added 15,000 things to the resolution, had I realized.
Yeah.
But we haven't voted like this before.
We were burned, the last time. No, we
Richard,
voted like
are
this.
we adjourning?
Oh, yeah, okay. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay. And do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor? Okay, we're adjourned.